So good morning, good afternoon, or evening to everybody. And thank you for taking the time to join us for this joint event between the permanent representation of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva and the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research here in Geneva, on exploring science and technology review mechanisms under the Biological Weapons Convention. I'm Irmgard Eden. I'm working with the permanent representation of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Disarmament Conference here in Geneva. Advances in science and technology can have positive and negative implications for many articles of the BWC. As such, having a more systematic approach to monitoring science and technology and better understanding of the implications could help us keep the BWC up to date. In 2020, Germany provided a 2-year voluntary contribution to UNIDIR to explore science and technology review mechanisms under the BWC. The project is carried out in close collaboration with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research here in Geneva. This project has 2 strengths. The first involves organizing 3 workshops in Geneva alongside upcoming BWC meetings. The second strand is a study undertaken by UNIDIR, which involves the systematic analysis of existing science and technology review mechanisms, as well as an examination of states parties' views regarding these mechanisms through surveys and focus group. It is the second component which is the focus of today's event. To discuss this issue further, I'm delighted to introduce our 4 speakers. First, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Peter Barrett, Ambassador of the Permanent Representation of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Disarmament Conference in Geneva. Second, I would like to welcome Mrs. Alicia Anand. Alicia is the Research Assistant for the Security and Technology Program at UNIDIR. She provides research support to all of SecTech's work streams. She's also the author of a new UNIDIR report looking at science and technology. Third, Mr. James Revel is Program Lead with the Weapons of Mass Destruction and Other Strategic Weapons Program. He has spent nearly 20 years working on issues relating to the BWC and is co-author on the report with Alicia. To wrap up the discussion, I would also like to introduce Mr. Kazuhiro Nakai, MX2 Chair of the Biological Weapons Convention and Deputy Permanent Representative of the Delegation of Japan to the Disarmament Conference in Geneva. Thanks to the 4 of you taking the time to join us at this event. I'm delighted to have you agreed to speak. I should like to make very clear at this event, all 4 panelists are speaking in their personal capacity. I will invite them all to make some opening remarks shortly, but before doing so, I wanted to encourage all of you to submit questions. We are quite constrained of time, so rather than take oral questions, I would encourage you to please use the chat function to submit written questions. The chat function button can be found in the bar at the bottom of the Zoom window. Click that and please enter your question. If you would like us to attribute the question, please type in your name as well, otherwise we will not attribute comments or questions. Other participants will not be able to see your questions, the panelists will. We will try to get as many questions as possible, but no promises as we have limited time. So without further ado, I will get into the discussion now, and I would like to begin with the first set of introductory remarks from Ambassador Peter Barrett. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Irmgard, thanks very much for the kind introduction, and I can promise that I will keep my opening remarks, because I'm not going to say much more than just opening remarks, very concise, since I would like to leave as much time as I can to both Alicia and James in particular, since they will be presenting the substance, what you all want to hear about. But firstly, let me extend a very warm welcome to you all to this presentation of the UNIDIR study under the title Exploring Science and Technology Review Mechanisms under the BTWC. That study has, as you know, been commissioned by the German government. And I'm sorry that we can't be together in a room in person, but have to continue these meetings virtually. But I can't continue without saying that I've just by clicking through the participants list seen that we are together with a lot of colleagues, that's very good, and some colleagues with whom I have cooperated, I mean, for more than 20 years. And allow me just to name 3 of them without wanting to set back any of the others, and that's Bob Mikulak, with whom I've really been working together on both CWC and BWC issues since the late 90s, and Richard Guthrie, with whom I've had lots of discussions in the margins of BTWC meetings some 20 years ago. And the third I discovered was Daniel Fix, and for him this more or less the same applies. I'm saying that because my time here in Geneva is up at the end of August. So since it's quite possible that we won't see each other in person, I would just like to pay special tribute to these 3 without actually, as I said, setting back any others with whom I've worked together too, in particular my German colleagues whom I greeted in German before we officially started. Now, just a couple of remarks. At past review conferences of the BTWC, many states parties submit a proposal in support of enhancing the science and technology review process under the convention. However, as we all unfortunately had to realize, we haven't had agreement on how to achieve this exactly in concrete terms. So to achieve progress, we as states parties would need to converge on issues such as the objectives and outputs of any mechanism, as well as practical matters related to the nature and the scope of participation. Now, in our national view, which I suspect is shared by all of you here, the mechanism to review developments in science and technology has been long overdue. And I don't need to repeat the reasons to this audience, but just like to remind you that a scientific advisory board has been working very successfully for more than 20 years in a sister organization, the OPCW in The Hague. So why not also achieve such a decision and get a body working under the BTWC? So this is with this objective why we made another attempt. In 2019, we submitted a national paper with a specific proposal, and we commissioned the UNIDIR study. And the study that is now before us provides ample considerations of important issues such as objectives, participation, ways of working, etc., etc. And it makes clear that there are many options for such a body. At the end, however, it is in the hands of states parties to take a political decision on what they actually want. So, in concluding, let me express the hope that this study will help to facilitate this decision-making process. And thank you very much for that. And now I think we're all looking forward to the presentation of what the study contains. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I will shortly turn the floor to Alicia Anand, but before doing so, I encourage you all to submit your questions as we move along. Alicia is now going to provide the results of the UNIDIR study with a particular focus on the survey results. Alicia, you have the screen.
Thank you, Imgad and Ambassador Beerworth, and hello everyone. As Imgad mentioned, I will present some of the key findings of our study on exploring science and technology review mechanisms under the Biological Weapons Convention, with a particular focus on the survey results. Later, based on the findings, my colleague James Revel will discuss the areas of divergence and convergence and possible options for states parties to consider ahead of the 9th review conference. In the first phase of our study, we identified and analyzed 20 existing S&T review mechanisms using desk-based analyses, and we undertook 19 interviews with leading experts working on these mechanisms. Our analyses focused on 7 key aspects: mandate and focus, selection and composition, leadership structure, ways of working, institutional support, types of outputs, and funding. The results from this phase, along with research into past BWC discussions on this issue, then informed the development of a survey of states parties' views on a possible review mechanism. The final report provides background analyses, interview and survey findings, along with possible options for states parties to consider. Today, I will provide an overview of some of the key findings of the survey. But before I present the survey findings, I want to make a quick note on the survey questions and data. The survey questions were of 3 types: single choice, multiple choice, and rating questions, and not all respondents answered all the questions in the survey. 42 states parties responded to the survey. We would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for your participation. The respondents were diverse in terms of geographical representation and the range of views and positions on this issue. Of the 42 responses, roughly 17 came from the Western European and others group, 7 came from the Eastern European group, and 18 came from NAM. At the onset, we asked states parties how important is the establishment of a S&T review mechanism. 39 of the 42 survey respondents believe that the establishment of an S&T review mechanism within the BWC is essential or important. However, not all had this view. 3 survey respondents felt that this was only somewhat important or not important at all. And some suggested reasons for this included that the establishment of an S&T review mechanism is not justified given the absence of a verification mechanism and the lack of an institutional mechanism for the implementation of Article 10. On the other hand, survey respondents that support the establishment of a review mechanism said it was important or essential to do so to keep the BWC up to date and capable of responding to new challenges, to inform policymakers on guidance with respect to dual-use technologies, and to achieve a proper balance between preventing biological warfare and fostering economic cooperation and development. A further analysis of the data based on regional groups showed that support for a review mechanism is strongest among members of the Western group. Responses to the survey also suggest that any BWC S&T review mechanism may need to address a range of different issues. All respondents agreed that it would be important or essential for a mechanism to address risks posed by advances in science and technology. 38 of 41 respondents felt that the scientific and technological implications for addressing compliance could also be important or essential to consider. And 37 of 41 respondents indicated that it would also be important or essential for any mechanism to address potential benefits of these developments. A significant number of respondents also identified national implementation, assistance under Article 7, and international cooperation under Article 10 as important or essential areas to address. In relation to this later point, it is important to note that a review mechanism would, by its very nature, support the exchange of information and then, in turn, promote international cooperation. There are different views regarding how specific priority areas and questions should be determined and who should do this. 33 of 37 respondents suggested that it is important or essential that states parties determine the specific priority areas. And 33 of 39 respondents have suggested that it is important or essential that participants in the S&T review mechanism determine the specific priority areas. Others felt that this should be done at intersessional meetings, for example, through the MX chair, yet others suggested that there could be a possible role for the Bureau. These options are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some mechanisms, like the EU Scientific Advisory Mechanism, adopt a bidirectional approach, where topics to be addressed can be proposed by the governing body and, in some cases, by the participants of the mechanism. Having a clear process for determining priorities is what's important. Now, if there is indeed appetite for some form of a mechanism, it could be useful for states parties to think about how to find a proper balance between setting topics for discussions in advance and ensuring flexibility to address issues as they emerge. Past discussions in the BWC suggest there is divergence in states parties' views on participant numbers. Our survey results also reflect divergence on this issue. Just over half, 23 of 41 survey respondents favored limited participation between 10 and 50 participants, with the 10 to 30 category receiving strong support. And on the other hand, a total of 12 respondents favored some sort of an open-ended model of participation that may be open to one or limited number of nominees per state party, or even open to all experts. Additional qualitative responses also indicated explicit support for an open-ended model. For example, one response stated that all states parties have the right to participate in any discussions under the convention. Breaking down survey results further by region showed that both the Western group and NAM states that submitted responses were divided in terms of support for a closed versus open participation model. Interviewees suggested that independence was important for the credibility of any review mechanism. And 31 of 39 survey respondents suggested that explicit instructions to participants on the technical focus of a mechanism could facilitate independence. While 26 supported some form of declaration on acting in an independent capacity, 2/3 also suggested that participants should declare competing interests, and some others favored the evaluation of participants' technical credentials. This later point raises questions over who evaluates and on what basis. Interviewees with experience in other mechanisms largely agreed on the fundamental importance of institutional support for effective S&T reviews. Most respondents seemed to agree that additional support staff for a review mechanism would be required. And 17 of 40 survey respondents favored the establishment of an additional full-time technical post or post in the ISU, while 8 favored the establishment of an additional part-time technical post or posts, and further 7 favor the establishment of a dedicated secretariat for the mechanism. And regarding the role of the support staff, survey respondents appeared to be more supportive of the support staff playing an administrative role rather than a substantive function. On the issue of funding, half of the 40 survey respondents suggested that an S&T review mechanism should be funded through a combination of assessed contributions and voluntary funds for additional activities. 10 favored voluntary contributions, and a few others suggested that assessed contributions from states parties would be desirable. Of note, only 3 respondents suggested that states parties should fund the cost of national representatives. However, this might need further consideration if an open-ended model of participation is adopted. And in terms of what survey respondents are willing to fund, there was convergence in support for covering costs of meetings, institution support, and the production and translation of outputs. The survey responses suggest that there will also be regional differences in approaches to funding. NAM states parties, for example, appear comparatively more supportive of using voluntary contributions. And that's all from me. Thank you for your attention, and over to you, Imgard.
Thank you, Alicia, once again for this in-depth and detailed overview. Thank you so much. I will now turn to James Revel to provide an overview of convergence and divergence and some of the possible options for state parties to consider in seeking to take this forward. Jamie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Imgard. Thank you to my colleague and co-author, Alicia. And of course, thank you to Ambassador Bearworth for very much setting up my part of the talk. In this session, what I really wanted to do is to present a sort of overview of areas of divergence and convergence, as well as some of the possible options for a science and technology review mechanism for states parties to consider. To be very clear, in presenting these options, it's not an attempt to try and be prescriptive, but really it is to present ideas for consideration. This is food for thought for states parties to make a political decision around should they wish. And before I get into this, I thought it might be useful to echo a point made by Imgard earlier on, and really to reiterate that advances in science and technology can have positive or negative implications for several articles of the Biological Weapons Convention. In some cases, science and technology can create risks or challenges to the convention, but in other cases, it can also create opportunities, for example, in the form of improved assistance or augmented investigations of non-compliance, or indeed in terms of international cooperation under Article 10. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because for science-based disarmament agreements, there does seem to be a logic to having a more systematic process of assessing science and technology. At the same time, it's also clear that not all states parties think this is important, or think this is has to be part of a wider collection of measures. And we've been quite careful to reflect those views and make sure that they are in the report and clear and explicit, because they are also important for us to take into consideration moving forward. Do support a mechanism. I think there are areas of convergence and divergence evident. And in terms of convergence, there seems to be some general agreement on issues related to leadership, potentially some meeting arrangements, and the need for institutional support. I won't dwell on those further. Instead, I'll concentrate on those areas of divergence, because I think these are particularly important to consider. And indeed, they may require further consideration both at the intra and international levels. Particularly important amongst the areas of divergence, I think, are the following three, loosely clustered around purpose and topic, participation, composition, and funding and resources. Concerning the purpose of any mechanism, our survey showed that while many thought a mechanism was important or essential, they didn't necessarily do so for the same reasons. And there may be some divergence around what a mechanism is supposed to do, who it's for, and how any outputs or advice may be used. Having some degree of clarity around that can be useful in making sure that any mechanism meets the end user requirements of states parties. There's also the issue of selecting particular topics. Unlike other review mechanisms in other organizations, there is no Director General position for the Biological Weapons Convention, nor do we necessarily at present have strategic documents from which lists of topics can readily be identified. So to some extent, models that apply and work in other issue areas and in other organizations aren't necessarily going to be applicable to the Biological Weapons Convention context. So this is an area where some further consideration may be required. And as Alicia has pointed out, there are some options here, but it will require some further thinking. And it also requires trying to find that balance between a flexible mechanism that is able to adapt to emerging issues in a timely fashion, and then having a sort of perhaps a more overarching framework or set of topics which are decided at an episodic review conferences, for example. The second issue, now a second area of divergence, and I think this is a potentially one of the more significant ones, is the issue of participation or composition. As Alicia pointed out, and both in the survey and also the working papers from the last couple of years, it's fairly clear there is difference in opinion between those favouring a more limited set of participants nominated by states parties, who would effectively form a sort of closed group of geographically representative eminent experts, and those on the other hand who see this as more of an open-ended process in which all states parties could potentially nominate an expert or experts to join the discussion, and those experts would drop in or join depending on the topic being discussed. I think in practice, the actual number of people involved, depending on how any eventual mechanism, if there is appetite, could emerge. In practice, operationally, the numbers may not be that different, but it is an important discussion to have around those two processes. I'll come back to this as well, because I think although it's often presented as being a binary choice between one or the other, there may be areas where compromise is possible or hybrid arrangements could be considered further. And the third point I want to talk about is this issue of funding and resources. I think particularly important here are the discussions around covering two key things, the meeting costs and some form of institutional support. Costs of meetings could, of course, be cut down with virtual events, and I think there may be people in the audience who can talk from their experience in that. But this has been an issue in the BWC, and it may be, if you want a 5-day meeting in person, then there are going to be costs attached to that. And then the issue of having resources for institutional support will also be important. And it's worth reiterating that many of the interviewees working in other mechanisms were very clear that if you want an effective and a credible mechanism, there needs to be institutional support for that mechanism. So there are these sort of financial issues as well. It's also probably worth noting that there's the issue of independence as well, and several interviewees stressed the importance of a mechanism being free from political or commercial interference or influence. I think there are ways this can be done, and Alicia has pointed to some in her outline of the survey, things like explicit instructions to participants or declarations that participants are acting in an independent capacity. So I think there are tools, but states parties will need to decide how best to move forward with that. Building on some of our findings and wider sort of review of the policy papers, as well as some of the background discussion around this, around scientific advice and scientific advisory mechanisms, we identified 3 options for states parties to consider. As indicated before, we're not trying to be prescriptive. This is intended as food for thought. But we thought it'd be useful to at least have some concrete ideas as to how this could potentially look. And I'll start with the first one, which is the limited participation model. This would loosely resemble mechanisms used in other organizations, such as the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Scientific Advisory Board, and would essentially draw from a select group of qualified geographically representative technical experts nominated by states parties and who will serve for a maximum of 2 to 3 year terms. States parties would determine the topics for any review group for this review group at the 5-yearly review conference process, although an intermediary body comprised of chairs of the meeting of states parties and MX2, supported by the ISU, could potentially consider additional topics between review conferences. The group itself could meet twice a year, first to collect information, and then second meeting with a view to finalizing the technical report and, where appropriate, developing recommendations. This could have the advantage of having a steady and stable representative set, geographically representative set of expert participants. And I should also point out, as indicated before, costs could be saved through virtual meetings. The second model is an open-ended model, and this would allow interested states parties to send a maximum of 1 or 2 expert participants. The review conference in this particular model could provide an overarching mandate for the mechanism. However, individual states parties could submit specific topics or questions on emerging issues for consideration, either in the annual meetings or at another point. One thing we added to this model as well was this idea of having a scoping paper, which is a mechanism used in other review processes to make sure that issues are suitable and the questions that can actually be answered by science. And that involves a little bit of back and forth between the participants and the organization as well. But I think that's quite important to keep in mind, because you have to make sure your question is answerable by the science. So the group in this context could meet once a year, with further outputs developed through virtual meetings. This could potentially have advantages in addressing some of the concerns raised that all states parties have the right to participate in any discussion under the convention. And it could also potentially have greater capacity to address emerging topics and questions. In the past, these 2 different approaches have often been presented in some ways as almost a binary choice. You choose one or the other. I think that can be a bit misleading. So one of the things we tried to do was to flesh out what a hybrid review process could look like, or at least one version of what a hybrid review process could look like. In the way we presented this, we start off with an open-ended meeting. This could be of 1 week in length, it could be open to nominated representatives, and potentially this could take place in conjunction with an existing international scientific conference on a topic of relevance to the BWC. This group would then address a particular question, will be open to all nominated qualified experts, but potentially also a selected number of international experts from outside government who could present and feed into the discussion. Based on this discussion, a rapporteur from the ISU could then develop a factual technical report that would be sent to BWC states parties, as well as a Science and Technology Committee of some form that would be comprised of a limited number of qualified experts nominated by states parties and selected by the chair. This committee would then be responsible for synthesizing the technical report into more accessible briefing materials, for identifying implications, and where appropriate and where valid, developing recommendations for consideration by states parties. This is one approach, an outline of one approach to this hybrid model. There are many others that could be considered as well. So just go to the final slides, please, Letitia. Thank you. So I think there are options available to states parties, and it certainly seems to me that science and technology is clearly of relevance to many articles of this convention. I think it's also important to keep in mind that any discussion on a review mechanism cannot be detached from the wider politics of the Biological Weapons Convention. And any effort is unlikely to achieve consensus unless it forms part of a wider package of measures reflecting the interests of all states parties. With that, I'll stop and hand over back to you, Gard. But just to say thank you to our colleagues from the German Federal Foreign Office for all their support in this project. And thank you to some of our reviewers, I think, for the paper who are also in the audience. But thank you for your time as well. I'm happy to take questions or speak with anybody bilaterally on this separately. Thank you, Gard. Back over to you.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for presenting these very interesting findings. This study has, of course, a lot of work and a lot of research. So thank you again for presenting the findings today. I would like now to open the floor to the discussions and to questions. So I would like to come back to the review mechanism in itself. And I would like to ask you, could you elaborate a little more on what other review mechanisms do and what you envision this review mechanism for the BWC is supposed to do, so that we get more clearance?
In terms of what a BWC mechanism would do, I think that's a fundamental decision for states parties to make. And then once you work out what you want this to do, what outputs you want and who those outputs are for, I think then you can look at sort of developing the mechanism to meet those end user requirements. In terms of looking at wider mechanisms, there really is quite a range of different approaches to doing this. Some provide information, others are more action orientated and provide actual advice or recommendations to be acted upon. So it really does depend on the mechanism, but one thing I would say that they are tailored to meet the aims of the wider aims of the object of the organization or the entity they are associated with. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamie. I understand from your response that states parties still have to do some basic decisions and basic considerations. But I think we could also discuss further the mechanism itself. I think independence in science and technology mechanism is quite important. So I wanted to ask you, do the panel have ideas as to how the mechanism can be made independent? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Imgard. I can take that question. So in my findings, I had already in the presentation spoken about a few ways to ensure independence, but I can also reflect on some of the examples of other mechanisms and how they ensure independence. For example, the EU Scientific Advisory Mechanism, for example, asks to declare any conflict of interest, and the WHO actually includes independence very explicitly in the terms of reference. So there are different ways of doing this, but it would be, again, going back to what the states parties decide, yeah.
Okay, so you play the game back to us. States parties have to do their work and their homework. Thanks a lot, Alicia. Let me stick a little bit to this. I think besides states parties, there are other actors interested in the mechanism. So what do you think, James or Alicia, what role would there be for non-state expertise in any mechanism? How could their views be brought into the discussion? I think they have good arguments to add to the discussions. So how to include them? What is your view? Thank you.
Yeah, I can say that. I mean, I think there's clearly going to be benefits from engaging with those at the cutting edge of any field and bringing their expertise into any discussion. I think that'll be important. That there are different approaches as to how you could achieve that. And how you get people in. I think there are good models from other organizations as well as to how that can be done. At the same time, I think there may be a bit of hesitancy about bringing in non-governmental experts to any mechanism looking at implications or making recommendations. There may be political sensitivities around that for some states. But I think certainly using that, making the most of external technical expertise will be important for keeping any mechanism really at the cutting edge of science as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamie. Jamie, Alicia, I have another question for you. I would like to know how do you plan to address the fact that the establishment of an S&T review mechanism, irrespective of the details of its setup, cannot be addressed in isolation, but needs to be looked at in the framework of the design of intersessional process as a whole in a balanced package. So any ideas on this? Thank you so much.
Okay, I mean, I think there are a number of ways you'd have to fit it around the BWC mechanism in terms of timing. For example, you want to make sure that it feeds in with the wider BWC meetings, so you make sure you time your events and your organisation of work so the outputs hit those optimum points where you can capture state's attention. I think it also depends to some extent, and here is where it gets a bit difficult because it's not entirely clear what will happen at the 9th review conference. I think certainly there are many people are optimistic and hopeful, but I think it will fundamentally depend on what sort of situation emerges. If we have a similar process with MX and MSPs, then I think there could be a logic to having a sort of particular questions asked during an MX, which are then addressed and presented at the MSP the next year, probably to provide enough time. Could be one way of doing it, but again, it's one of those things for states parties to determine. I also see Richard Guthrie has just put his video on, God, so there may be a question from Richard as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Jamie. And indeed, I see a question here. And the question is about key tasks of the science and technology process, which is described as independently identifying threats and benefits, current and future. And secondly, sensitizing policy processes to S&T issues and providing independent S&T advice to those processes. This obviously overlap, but the divergence on participation issues, i.e. limited versus open-ended, seems to reflect the divergence in perspectives on both threats described. So the question is the key to achieving consensus finding a hybrid format that combines the tasks in 1 and 2?
I mean, again, it's getting into territory which I think is political, and that's for states parties to decide these sort of things. And I'm a bit hesitant to go beyond laying out options for consideration, but I think it's certainly a useful point that has been raised in terms of thinking that through. Alicia, please feel free to elaborate on that rather poor answer.
I agree with you, Jamie. I think, as Jamie mentioned, we just presented ideas and it's again up to states parties on what they want the mechanism to do. And then all the other aspects can be decided around that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamie, Alicia. You're playing the ball back again to us. I see we have a brilliant study now, but states parties still need to do their homework and deeper dig into the issue and to make their own decisions and get clear of what they really want. But let's see a little bit more into the issue. I have one question on the issue of the composition of such a review process. Did you work on that? How can a mutually acceptable solution be found on the issue of the composition of such a review process? Any ideas from you? Thanks a lot.
I think the hybrid model maybe be a way of ensuring that both you have a smaller group that is focused and has the expertise to discuss these issues in detail, and then you have a bigger group which involves larger participation and can discuss that can include all points of views and can discuss the issues and in line with what the states parties to fulfill their needs. So I think that can be a way of doing that, to having a more one smaller focused group and then a bigger group that can focus on the discussion. So the smaller group can also, for instance, work on the outputs, and then the bigger group can discuss a range of different issues, and then the smaller groups can go more into the detail. So there are different ways of doing that. And another way also is of having technical working groups as well. And that, Imgard, you had asked a question about how external experts can be engaged in the mechanism. So that is also another way of including and involving expertise from outside in the mechanism as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Alicia. This immediately pops up a follow-up question. How do you think a possible scientific board should interact both with the political core of the BWC, so as to say state parties, and the scientific community? Thank you.
I think in terms of engaging with the wider community, if you look at what the OPCW Scientific Advisory Board, for example, has been able to do, it provides advice, but it also provides that outreach function. And I know they've had meetings outside of The Hague as well, in which and various other activities in which they're actually able to represent and take the convention to different communities, which I think is something perhaps feeds into other aspirations within the convention, for example, for engagement, awareness raising and outreach. So I think potentially things to engage more widely could usefully be undertaken. Of course, that will depend fundamentally on choices by states parties as to what they're mandated to do, but there is that opportunity there as well. In terms of engaging with states, then I think it's useful. I think one of the things we had in our feedback was that it's useful to have space where delegates, diplomats can ask questions. So rather than it being a one-way process of lecturing, actually having that space for Q&A, potentially even more interactive approaches. And I think there are some good ideas from the SAB in that regard about Science for Diplomats events and things like that, which could be useful to explore further. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And here comes a follow-up question from the audience. Alicia, Jamie, can you say something about the costs, possible costs arising from this mechanism? And the second question is, are there international examples of the hybrid approach which you just presented? Thank you so much.
Good question on the examples. I mean, just if I may first on that bit, a lot of mechanisms, and this includes, well, can often build on the basis of bigger meetings first or bigger, wider expert group meetings, including non-governmental experts as well, before feeding into a more closed working group. So there are cases of that. Past experience with the OPCW is one of those. And in terms of the costs, I can talk about these. I feel it's important to caveat these, that these are based on an assessment, and as it indicates in the text, it kind of depends on what you'd like this to do. But on the basis of the models that we laid out, if you were looking for a limited participation model with 2 meetings, including a 5-day meeting in Geneva, and an in-person meeting, that would be about 400,000. It would be considerably reduced if you were to have one single in-person meeting to about 329,000. Similarly, the open-ended approach by our calculations was about 319,000. And then the hybrid model was more expensive, so it got into sort of 400,000. But in each of these cases, it depends on what states want. There are costs that can be saved through virtual meetings. There are ways to reduce those costs. And if you break it down, the amount paid per state is probably going to be considerably less. It may seem like a big number compared to the existing budget of the BWC, but I think if you look at the wider context of international organizations and then look at how that would figure into assessed contributions, it's actually really quite a small amount.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamie. Do you think, this is a question again from the participants, there are any lessons which we can draw from the COVID-19 pandemic? I'm not sure if this question closely relates to the cost implications or in a wider context, but I think connected to cost implications, it's a lot about how to have virtual or in-person meetings, and the question how to have meetings, for example, back-to-back with other important BWC meetings. So do you have any ideas already how the COVID-19 pandemic impacts our reflections on the SNT's review mechanism? Thank you.
Well, I think that is probably one of the most important reflections from the COVID-19 pandemic, that the virtual meetings is possible, and that they are possible, and also they are useful as well to engage different audiences and different people from all over the world as well. So I think that the acceptance of having virtual meetings is one of the key things, and that would, as Jamie said, in terms of cost, play a big role, and in reducing the cost of a mechanism to be able to have not only at the main meetings, but also if experts want to consult themselves through the review process or through writing the outputs, they don't have to each time meet physically. So I think that acceptance of having virtual meetings and virtual interactions is something that would help the cost aspect a lot of the mechanism.
Just one of them is slightly anecdotal, but I was struck by comments over the course of last year, I can't remember who by, but raised the point that their personal connections they've forged through interaction on BWC issues were very important when it came to responding to COVID, because they had somebody, they knew their counterpart in country X who they could contact to discuss some of these issues. So I think it does highlight the point of those connections that could be generated through this sort of mechanism could potentially be important. And again, it highlights the convening capacity of the BWC more generally. I think the other issue which could potentially, which the experience points to, is that scientific advice is not necessarily a clean consensus and converging around one neat answer. I think that perhaps encourages a little bit of thinking about how do you deal with minority views, how do you make sure that information reflects a range of different perspectives. So we're not always going to have consensus on scientific issues, and if there is not consensus there, that should be reflected, and I think that's a point raised in some of the working papers by states parties as well. Yeah, 2 points from me.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I think this also comes up here in the questions from the audience also, that science and technology input is not necessarily uniform. To wrap up or to close up a little bit the discussion we have now, what you both think are the most significant findings from your analysis of other science and review mechanisms, and yeah, just to get your idea on that. Thank you.
So I just have 2 additional points. I think one point that was really interesting that came out from our interview findings was the importance of feedback and between the mechanism and the states parties, that there should be continuous communication, maybe even informal communication and feedback. So the review mechanism is actually addressing the needs of the state party as well. So I think that constant feedback and informal communication was considered as a lesson learned, for example, with some mechanisms. The other point that was raised was the importance of personalities and how those informal relationships and communications really helped in the success of the review process, including getting consensus and including ensuring independence and ensuring that the discussions are in line with what the states parties or the governing body of a mechanism needed. So I think those were 2 interesting points that came out. And I think one of the main things was really defining the rationale and the purpose of a mechanism. I think we've repeated this point many times through the last 1 hour, but even before in our presentation, but then having that clear rationale on why you need this and what you intend to do with this, then really sets the ground for structuring everything around it. So if that is not very clear, then everything else kind of can start falling apart. So I think really having that clear rationale of why and for what is quite important. I think that was a really recurring theme in all our interviews. Jamie might have additional points.
Can I follow up on that, Irmgard?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, Jamie.
So I'd echo the point on personalities matter. I think that's important. And it also links to something which came about in the discussions we had. You can set a position, set a mechanism up, but it will evolve, and it should indeed evolve to meet the changing needs of states parties. So anything set up in the 9th Review Conference, hypothetically, is not fixed forever. It will evolve, and it should evolve as personalities change, as requirements change. 2 other things came across as important. The first is the importance of institutional support was echoed by several people. I know I've mentioned that before, but it does seem to be important. And then one thing I found particularly novel was the scoping paper that I mentioned before as well. But the idea of having a discussion between the end users and then the participants in any organization to make sure the question is answerable by science, make sure the question is not political or is not something which is beyond the scope of the mechanism. That could be quite useful to consider further forward. And I'll stop there, but thank you, Amgad.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you so much, Alicia. Time is running. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I would like now to hand over the floor to Mr. Nakai, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Japan to the Conference on Disarmament and the chair of the second meeting of experts, to provide some closing remarks. Mr. Nakai-san, you have the screen.
Thank you very much, Imigad-san. And I must start this remark by expressing deep appreciation for Alicia-san and James-san for their fantastic presentation of important research. And I have to thank German Foreign Ministry to help it make it happen. The research which is presented today is indeed comprehensive, demonstrate all key issues related to science and technological review mechanisms, and also demonstrate wide range of views in BWC community. This work is of great relevance for MX2, which I have honor to chair. Science and technological review mechanism, a mechanism to review and address both risk and benefit of the science related to the science and technological development has been important agenda in BWC, particularly in the MX2. The previous discussions and this research, fortunately, demonstrates the existence of good convergence of views on the value of such mechanism to enhance BWC. But at the same time, we have not achieved anything in this regard. I'm afraid I have to agree with Ambassador Peter Bierwas in his remark, who said that this issue has been long overdue, particularly in view that other important international organizations such as OPCW, WHO, IAEA, or International Climate has functioning the science technological review mechanisms. Thinking about what we have gone through in the COVID-19, the importance of such a mechanism is further highlighted in BWC. In the wake of ongoing pandemic, I am also of a view that it is very important for BWC to produce concrete and tangible outcomes to address the issue of common concerns and interests, possibly in the coming next review conference. And science and technological review mechanism is indeed one of the issues that we have to make some concrete and tangible outcome. As the MX2 chair, therefore, I'd further work to facilitate the discussions and explore all possible ideas, thus converge the views among member states towards to make good consideration and agreement in the review conference. One of the challenges is that there are more than a few concrete proposals, including very useful and well-crafted German proposals on this mechanism. And many countries have expressed their views through a variety of working papers. In further convergent views of the member states, this research, which helps us to understand all key aspects of the discussions and current area of convergence, area of divergence, issue to be addressed in futures, are of great help for me as the chair. From now, I'm going to organize an informal consultation 1 month before the MX2s. For the preparatory informal consultations and MX meetings in September, your work is going to, this work would help us very much to prepare the common basis of discussions. Once again, thank you very much for UNIDIR for this very valuable contribution for BWCs, and also the German government to make it happen. I'm very much looking forward to continue working and collaborating to both of you. As always, I remain completely open to any discussions or suggestions useful for the successful MX2. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Nakai-san, for your closing remarks, which show that we really have to sit down now and do our homework to continue the issue. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Thank you also to the team that produced this event, particularly to Letizia Zakan and Maria Gazon Maceda, who are working behind the scenes. Thank you also to you, the audience, for joining us for this event. Thank you so much, and have a good day or night, depending on where this finds you. Thank you so much.
Bye, colleagues.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.